Hey, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to talk about controlling gain and distortion with your fingers and with your hands. Now there are a lot of obvious ways to control gain and distortion. You can lower and raise the level of gain on your amp or on your effects pedals if that's where you're getting your distortion. You can get a noise gate to clamp down on that unwanted hiss and noise in between your playing, but I'm not talking about those ways of controlling gain and distortion. I'm talking about what you can do with just your hands and your fingers. In the first place, with the controls in your guitar, and in the second place, more importantly, with your playing dynamics and with your left and right hand muting. Now, when you play with gain and distortion, it's really easy for it to feel like the guitar is just ready to explode at any time. If you're really close to your amp, feedback will eventually come out, and in general, you're just not even playing it, it's just getting noisier and noisier. In general, it's just so much compression that goes on when you play with gain that everything seems loud, everything is in your face. This is why I recommend practicing with distortion if you're playing genres that actually use distortion. Some teachers will say you never want to practice with distortion because it covers up your mistakes, which to some extent can be true, but it also amplifies certain kinds of mistakes. Extraneous string noise, bum notes, they're all right in your face when you play with distortion. Now, the most obvious ways to control the level of gain in your guitar is with the controls in your guitar. Obviously, you can turn the entire thing off by rolling your volume knob back, but there's more to it than this. You can actually lower the amount of gain by backing off your volume. When you back off your volume, the signal that hits the front of your amp is lower and it causes it to distort less. So for example, this is fully open, but I can roll it off like this. Roll it off even more. And more. I can even make it almost clean here. It's kind of tough to do when you have a lot of distortion. What's cool about that is you have a continuous level of gain as opposed to just, switching a channel on your amp. Volume and gain are closely related. In fact, they mean the same thing in a lot of contexts. But in this case, lowering or reducing the signal that goes to your amp can actually cause it to distort less. And increasing that signal can cause it to distort more, which is why a lot of guys will get distortion out of their amp by getting just a volume boost pedal or just a straight clean boost to get more signal. Okay, so that's the most obvious way to control the level of gain coming out of your guitar. But also, what kind of pickups you have makes a difference too. So this is a useful guitar to illustrate this. If I'm back on my humbucker, you'll hear some noise. You hear some, it's hard to avoid all the noise coming out of your guitar. But if I switch it to one of my single coils, it's considerably noisier. If I have it on my humbucker, it's, there's some noise there, but it's not as bad as it would be if I had it on a single coil. You get that 60 cycle hum there, much more noisy. So what kind of pickups you're using make a difference here as well. You can't really hear it when you're playing. You can definitely hear it when you're not playing. All right, so apart from those pretty obvious ways to control distortion and gain on your guitar with your hands and fingers, what else am I talking about? Well, your playing dynamics here makes a difference. So if I play light, I'm playing quieter, and like the volume example with the volume knob, it'll cause the amp to distort less. And if I dig in, it makes a difference. So playing dynamics here can cause the amp to distort. You can even hear distortion more when you have more than one note playing at the same time. So, for example, just a single note here versus a double stop. The overtones of distortion come out more when you have intervals at play here versus single notes. So that's one way you can control it too. But probably the most important and overlooked way to control gain on an electric guitar is with muting, both fretting hand muting, in my case left hand, and picking hand muting, in my case right hand. So a good example here is with power chords. If I'm playing a power chord on the A string, say the 8th fret of the A string, 8, 10, 10. So that's an F power chord. I could just try to target those 3 strings with my right hand, but I'm not going to want to do that all the time. And even if I tried, I might make a mistake. So a good way to control accidental extraneous string noise, which is really loud when you play with guitar, you're going to want to mute with your left hand. You can mute that low E string by just touching it, butting your finger up against it. So you just get this percussive string noise sound out of it. And you can also mute the top strings with that same finger by just resting your finger across those strings. So I'm only putting pressure down on these frets, and I'm touching the bottom string and just touching the top string. So it goes. See how those top strings are also muted? Mute, mute, no, 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 mute. Then I can strum happily across those strings and have no issue. When you're on the low E string, it's even easier. There's a C power chord right there in the 8th fret of the E string. I don't have to worry about a bottom string there. I can just rest that first finger across, not bar across them. You don't want that. You want this. See how those top 3 are muted? I'm just resting my finger to just barely touching those strings while I put pressure on these 3. But what about when you're playing lead lines? How do you mute unwanted strings or notes in that case? Suppose you're playing B pentatonic minor here in the 7th fret of the low E string. Maybe a lick like this: 10-7 on B, 9-7 on G, and then 9 on D. That was pretty clean, but it's easy to play like this instead, where the G and the B strings ring out together. And that's a pretty cool sound if you want it to be, but you might not want that in a lot of contexts. Well, what I'm doing is I'm subtly just lifting my finger, the pressure of my finger at least, off of that B string before I get to the G string. When I'm finished with the note, I stop fretting it. Now in this case, I can get away with fully taking my finger off the fret because the ring finger is covering the B string, so I don't get this by accident. So as long as some other finger is going to cover an accidental open string there, you can just de-fret when you're done playing the note. If there isn't a string there to cover it, you're going to want to make sure you de-fret without accidentally pulling off to an open string, because those are going to be as loud as any other note you play when you're playing with distortion. Or here's another bluesy lick. A lot of songs have a lick like that. I'll leave it to your imagination or memory to figure out which one this might be. Here I'm playing the 9th fret of the B string. I'm bending up. And I'm walking up 7, 8, 9. And then bending up from here to 9. And then as I bend up from there, I grab the B string, which is already also bent, and bend it down to 9, and then play 7. Now the details of that riff aren't really important. What I want you to see here is you can also mute when you're playing lead with your right hand, in particular with the fingers surrounding your pick. So what I don't want is this. I mean, that could be cool, but I maybe want the strings and the notes to be more defined. Well, what I'm doing here to get these notes to ring out cleanly and individually is something I figured out over just years of playing. No one told me how to do this. I guess my fingers just found what they had to do. Is I use my index finger surrounding my pick to mute the high E string when the time comes. Almost on my way to hitting that next note. Can't do it slow, right? So on your way to hitting a note, you can use your thumb or your index finger to mute an unwanted string. And I think you'll find that you can use your thumb or your index finger to just tap a string on your way to playing the next note in a way that mutes it just in the right time. So give that a try when you're stuck trying to mute something when you're playing a lead line. All right, so just to quickly review, many ways you can control the gain in your guitar. First of all, with the knobs, you can just go fully on or off with your volume knob, or you can roll back the gain as well, even if you have a really distorted amp or pedal. Not all the way there. And roll it back in. If you're playing with single coils, You're going to get more noise versus if you're playing with humbuckers. So be aware of that if you have a section where you want a lot of silence on your guitar and you don't want that silence to be overcome with 60 cycle hum. But more importantly, you can mute with your left and your right hand, or your fretting and your picking hand. With your fretting hand, with power chords, you can mute the other strings you don't want to play. When you're in something of an open position, you can use your free fingers to mute the strings. With your right hand, of course, you can mute by karate chopping down on the strings in a way that's sort of continuous and flows with the way you pick. Not in a way that's not continuous with it. It makes it harder to go back to picking. And when it comes to lead lines, you can mute by either defretting and making sure you're covering the strings that you're defretting if you take your fingers all the way off the string. Otherwise, just defret and leave your finger on the string. Or you can use the finger surrounding your pick to mute a note before you strike the next one just in time. Now, over the years, I found that it takes a lot of trial and error to figure out which techniques work best in which circumstances. But you are going to find you need something like this in a lot of cases to play cleanly with distortion. As much as people like to bag on playing with distortion and how it covers up mistakes, which there's some truth to that, it also highlights a lot of other mistakes that you don't want when you're playing that kind of music that uses that kind of distortion. All right, hope that helps.